Hi there, what's going on? In this video I'm going to show you how I painted my rendition of the Battle of Isandlwana. I'm going to spend the first few minutes of the video giving you the context of what exactly this battle is all about and what happened and why it's a remarkable battle. So in the first 5 or so minutes I won't really talk about the process, but I'll pick it up right afterwards. So because it's a long video anyway, you'll understand exactly what I'm doing in the following larger part of the video. I did this painting in 2 parts. The first part I did in 2020, so that will be the first 5 minutes. Then I picked it up later in 2022 where I made the adjustments that are going to be the main part of the video. The Battle of Isandlwana was the first major encounter between British forces and Zulu forces in South Africa, and it took place in January of 1879. So what happened was, in December the previous year, the British High Commissioner decided to annex the friendly Zululand. He had presumed that the Zulu, with their inferior weapons like spears and clubs and shields, would be easy prey. So what he did was he gave the Zulu king, Seshwayo, unreasonable demands to dismantle his army in 30 days or else the British would move in and take over Zululand. So inevitably, when Seshwayo refused to do this, the British moved in, and their plan was to get in through 3 sections of Zululand and eventually capture Ulundi, which was the capital. They got in unopposed, and on January 22nd, which was about a month after the ultimatum was given, over half of the soldiers found themselves following what they thought was the real Zulu army. But what they didn't know was that they were tricked into following this decoy. And behind them, they left at the foot of the hill called Isandlwana about 1,700 troops. The troops were well armed, but unfortunately for them, they were really outnumbered. And since they weren't prepared to be ambushed, they didn't really set up a protective unit around them. So they were kind of caught unawares when about 20,000 Zulus just ran into them. The Zulus were actually on their way to capture the first battalion that had been fooled into following a false Zulu army. So they just ran into this relatively unprotected camp of British soldiers and just sprang into action. In the 2-hour battle that followed, 1,300 of the 1,700 British were killed. Of the Zulu, only 2,000 out of the 20,000 were killed. So it was a decisive victory for the Zulu here. Somewhere in the middle of the battle, at around 2:29 p.m., there was a solar eclipse. And when the sun returned, not one tent was left standing. It had become a killing zone. Everybody was just lying on the ground. All the British, pretty much all of them, and the rest that were left were fleeing to a place called Rocks Drift, where they would then stage a defense for the second following attack by the Zulu. Actually, in the first part of the painting, you'll see I'm painting a dark sky. The reason why the sky is dark in this part is because my idea was to paint the moment when the sun had disappeared for a few minutes, just before it came back, and the extent of the damage or the extent of the defeat was really felt by just seeing these piles of dead bodies all over the place. In any case, when the news reached London, the British public was outraged because it was the biggest defeat, and still is to this day, the biggest defeat the British army has ever faced versus an indigenous army with inferior military weapons. Eventually, 6 months later, the British sent in a much more enlarged army, and they eventually captured Zululand. But at least for this particular battle, the defeat to the Zulu was remarkable. So that's why the Battle of Isandlwana sticks out amongst other battles when it comes to battles for colonialism and independence, not only African but worldwide. So what you're seeing on the screen right now was what was my best effort back in 2020. But 2 years later, I thought it was a bit too sparse. Like there was too much space between the fighters, so it wasn't really showing the magnitude of the chaos that would be visible in a battle like this one. So I decided to add a few more characters and give that sense of confusion. So from this part onwards, that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to mix oil paint with a lot of solvent. The solvent I'm using in this case is kerosene. After mixing this up with a palette knife, I'll use a soft brush to paint lines on the canvas. First with kind of darkened version of that color, then I'll use a brighter version or even white itself to give me more accurate outlines. That's why for all these outlines you'll see me do them twice, and the second one will kind of deviate slightly from where the first one was. I'm then going to move on to acrylics, which are going to give me a background layer. I always like the background to have a medium shade or tint. I don't want it to be too dark or too light. So in some cases you'll see the backgrounds I'm starting with, like at the beginning of the video, was kind of maroon or crimson. In this case it's kind of brown, but it's normally whatever discarded acrylic paint I have lying around. Then I'm going to use a piece of chalk to draw in the outlines. So in this case I'm doing it freehand, which means they won't be perfect, but I'm just following what I see on my phone because I already have this image exactly how I want it to be. Before I start painting, I normally sketch on my sketch pads and in Photoshop, so I know exactly what I'm going to paint in every stage. So now back to oil paints. This time I've just done exactly what I did before, which was mix oil paints with a lot of solvent, then use that to draw the same way a pen would draw on paper, the lines that I'm going to use as my guidelines for the next stage. I'll then take a soft brush that I'll dip in kerosene in my solvent, wipe that on canvas, then use it to wipe or to rub off the chalk that I'd used as my first outlines. Then the oil paint that I'd painted afterwards will stay stuck onto the canvas, so now it will be clearer which lines I'm supposed to be following. The next step is going to be the underpainting, and this is the stage where I'm going to use both silk vinyl, which is the white paint you see now, and dark acrylic paint that will mix into this gradient that flows from dark to light. Now you can see where the outlines come in because they're just guiding me. So all I'm doing with the acrylics in this case is to simply follow the borders or the boundaries that the outlines before had given me. When I'm done painting the characters, which is what I normally start with when painting my underpaintings, I then move on to the background. It will be a different process in the later stages when I'm using oils, because then I normally start with the background and not with the main characters in the foreground. So now I'm painting what's going to be the sky with, again, more acrylic. Oil can do the job, but since it's a flat sky background that I'm going to add the details onto, I'm going to start with acrylic in this case. Then of course I'll have the new part that I'm working on kind of overlap a little into the older part, so that when I finally paint with oils, there won't be a clear border between the part I painted first and the part I painted last. I'm then going to use masking tape to block out all the tops of the heads and the hands and the spears and the flags that I want to be protected when I'm painting the sky. Then using a pen through the translucent masking tape, I'm going to outline the areas that I need to cut out, which will be the next step. So at this point you can see I've done this all across the painting. So the next step will be to take out the masking tape, cut out the parts that have encroached into the sky, so that I'm only left with the areas I need to protect. In other words, the top part of the fighters in the foreground. I'll get rid of the part I don't need and take the part I need back to the canvas. So back to the canvas it goes, and you can see just how perfectly it fits. So after this I'm going to move on to the sky. So now the process has been reversed. As opposed to how I started with the foreground in the underpainting, now I'm going to start with the background in the final layer. For the sky I'm going to go with these colors you see on the palette right now. Then using a kind of a rough brush, I'm going to pick up the paint from the palette, rub it against a piece of canvas to distribute the paint evenly on the bristles, then move on to the canvas itself. I'll then apply the different colors that make up the sky. Then I'll blend them in just before they dry, so that they dry as a unit, as opposed to painting one color then leaving it for maybe more than 6 hours. Then it's difficult for me to blend them in into this kind of blurry or cloudy look. The next step now will be to get rid of the masking tape and reveal the fighters. And now it becomes even clearer just what the difference is going to be when this is compared to the first attempt or to the first finished painting from 2020. The sky is now different. I got rid of the eclipse, then now I'm going to have more of a daylight scene, and a more active one at that. So now that I want to move on to the fighters in the middle ground, that's the part of the painting that's after the background, I'm going to go back to the masking tape just as I did before, and using the same process protect now the fighters in the foreground, the fighters closest to us, so that I can focus on the ones at the back without worrying about smearing paint onto the ones I don't want to paint over. Back to the palette I go, and this time I'm mixing mostly skin tones. And because these are people in the background, I don't want the darkest colors to go all the way to black, so I'm going to lighten or to brighten every color in the palette. And for painting them, these are the brushes I'm going to use. You can see they're smaller than the ones I used before, but not small enough to give an incredible amount of detail, because in as much as these guys are closer to us than the clouds above them are, they're still not close enough for us to be able to see a lot of detailing. So I won't go much into painting like skin textures and stuff. It's going to be, as you can see right now, just an idea of what they look like. Then I'm going to blur those using an even wider brush just before it dries, so when I finally paint the fighters in the foreground with a lot of detail, it will be easy to tell who's at the back and who's at the front. For this part you'll see a general trend, which is I start painting most of these warriors with something called a local color. So this is a general color that covers most of the area that I want to paint. Then the shadows and the highlights in either order. Sometimes I start with the shadows, other times with the highlights. But for this painting I started pretty much every part with the local color. So that's what I'm doing For his face, for instance, I cover the whole face with a translucent layer of oil paint so that the underpainting beneath is still visible. Then the underpainting will guide me when I'm painting in now the shadows. Then the shadows will be followed by the highlights. And for the highlights, I don't start with white itself. So for this case, you can see I'm starting with the orange tints on his face. Then finally, the brightest colors will come last. In this case, I've switched up. So instead of starting with the shadows after the local color, I've started with the highlights. But as you'll see by the time I'm done painting his back, these are not the final highlights. There's going to be even brighter highlights coming up. And now you can see the actual highlights that are going to define his form. Sometimes you have to improvise. So for this fighter's form, for instance, I wanted a more realistic muscular structure, so I used my own back. So next up, I'm going to move on to the folded British flag. Then I get rid of all the masking tape that was protecting the fighters in the foreground. So we've covered the background and the middle ground, and now it's only a couple of fighters right in front of us. So this Zulu warrior will come first, then the final two British soldiers. For the people who are stepping on the ground or the people lying on the ground, it's normally advisable to start painting the shadows first. I mean the shadows they cast on the ground, because as much as it doesn't really apply this way, because you can't step on a shadow, it's not a physical object. Visually speaking, the shadows are behind them. So this person lying on the ground is lying on top of his shadow. So if you're painting someone like this, it's normally advisable to start with the shadow first, then paint the person on top. So the local color for his coat will be red. Then after the dark colors, I'll move on to the lighter colors. The darkest color in all parts of this painting is burnt umber. I do not use black in my paintings unless I'm painting a black and white painting. But for the brightest color, sometimes you'll see white, even though I try to avoid pure white as well. The reason why I don't use black, by the way, is because pure black barely ever exists in nature. Most of the things that are black are not actually black. In other words, in most cases, you can place something darker in front of them. Again, start with the shadows that this attire is casting, then the attire itself. If you start with this yellow kind of strings, then try painting the shadows around them. It will be like painting the sky in between individual leaves if you're painting a tree. You want to start with the sky first, then the tree on top. Even though I'm starting with the local color, then painting burnt umber on top, the burnt umber then isn't pure, because since I'm doing this before the local colors dry, the local color mixes with the burnt umber on canvas. If you want the shadows to be as dark as the colors come from the tube, then it's best to either wait for the local color to dry if you're using this method anyway, or as I'm doing for the trouser, to leave the parts that are going to be in total shadow untouched by the local color, so that when I'm painting the burnt umber, as you see I'm doing here, there's no blue beneath it to contaminate it or to make it brighter than I want it to be. Even when I'm painting something that's white, the local color then isn't white, it's kind of gray, because gray is kind of the midpoint between white itself and what will be its shadows. And so with that, we are pretty much done with most of the action, except there was one more thing I noticed at this point, which was one of the Zulu warriors was raising his arm but holding nothing. So let's find him something to hold, like a knife. Unfortunately, he's holding a 21st century knife in a 19th century battle, but let's assume he's a time traveler for this case and just move on with our lives. Like I said in the beginning, the Zulu warriors really had inferior weaponry in this battle, so it kind of works anyway, if you think about it. Anyway, the painting is done now. I'm going to sign out. And by the way, my signature is not exactly as creative as you would imagine an artist's signature would be, but it does the job. And now unfolded before us is my rendition of the Battle of Isandlwana. So what you've been watching was the half to your right. I'd already painted the one to the left before I started recording, so that's how I painted my Battle of Isandlwana. This painting measures 1.8 meters in height by 5.6 meters in length, and at the time of painting it, it was the biggest painting I'd ever done. I've done one bigger one since, which will be a topic of another video in another day. But for this one, I hope you enjoyed the process. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. The rest that were left were fleeing to a place called Rocks Drift, where they would then stage a defense for the second following attack by the Zulu. Now, actually, in the first part of the painting, you'll see I'm painting a dark sky. The reason why the sky is dark in this part is because my idea was to paint, oh my god, the sun is setting. It's setting. Shit, now it's dark. I hate myself. Okay, whatever. Oh, what a mess. I should have done this in the morning. Okay, so the reason why in this first part of the painting, I'm painting this kind of dark sky is because my idea was to paint the moment when the sun had disappeared for a few minutes.